President Reinhardt, guests, I'm very pleased to be here. I have decided not to read. I'd rather that you do that by yourself. It will go faster. Let me assure you that the book serves as a very good doorstop, and with a glass of warm milk will really put you to sleep well enough. A few people asked me before how long it took me to write this book. The actual writing took less than a year. Everything else took 40 years. I first became involved with Brandeis as a graduate student. The late Arthur Link, the noted biographer of Woodrow Wilson, wrote that Brandeis was the intellectual architect of Wilson's new freedom. And I and my mentor, William Luchtenberg, decided that would make a very good doctoral dissertation. And so in 1964, I, wife, and son went out to Ohio State University for my first job. And a few months afterwards, I got in my car and drove down to Louisville, where the bulk of the Brandeis papers are. It was a good trip and a bad trip. It was a bad trip because I discovered there wasn't enough in there to support a doctoral dissertation. It was a good trip because it eventually led to 7 volumes of Brandeis letters and everything else I did on Brandeis. About a dozen years ago, I said to myself that as I was nearing my 60s, that I needed a retirement project, and decided that what I would do when I retired would be to write a biography of Brandeis. And then the Commonwealth of Virginia helped me out by having financial problems and offering me early retirement, so I got started a lot earlier than I thought. What I'd like to do is talk about how I sort of dealt with Brandeis's life and then answer any questions you might. When I was describing the book, initially I said Brandeis essentially had 4 lives. First of all, he was a lawyer, something he was very proud to be, and when he was on the court, he kept reminding people, remember, I practiced law for more than 30 years before I came here. He was a lawyer at a time when the legal profession was in flux. Now, prior to the Civil War, you went to see a lawyer if you were going to sue somebody or if somebody was suing you. Whatever the problem was, it had already happened. After the Civil War, with the rise of big business, this became prohibitively expensive. If you were going to build a factory that was going to cost several $100,000, or if you were going to develop a tract of land, you could not afford to wait until after a problem arose. So you needed to see a lawyer ahead of time to find out, if I do this, will I be in trouble? What this meant was that lawyers, although they were still advocates if you had to go to court, became counselors. They began advising their clients on what to do, and Brandeis was among the best. He believed that his clients would have no faith in what he said to them unless he knew their business as well as they did. Interestingly, he also, the man who was opposed to bigness, was one of the pioneers in developing the modern type of law firm with its specializations. Even though he remained a generalist throughout his life, he and a number of the other leading attorneys of the late 19th century developed a type of law firm that we're now used to, with people who do real estate, people who do trust, people who do taxes. He did very well as a lawyer. At a time when most lawyers in the United States were making less than $5,000 a year, he was clearing well over $50,000, at a time when there was no income tax and when the dollar was worth a lot more than it is now. Having done well, he now decided to do good. And his second career is that of a reformer. Brandeis came from a family that emphasized ethics. In letters we have to his parents, he talks about how they were always telling him to do good. Not telling him do this, do that, not to be a good boy like that, but the idea of giving back to society, of trying to do the right thing. And like many progressive reformers, he starts locally. A client of his, Alice Lincoln, was very upset at the way that the city of Boston was treating patients in its insane asylum. out on an island in the middle of the harbor. And she wanted to do something about it. So she hired Brandeis to represent her and, to some extent, the patients at hearings before the city council to try to improve the conditions. At the end, she paid him, and he decided that he didn't want to accept money for this work and gave it back to her. This eventually led him to refuse any fees for public service work. And he really is a pioneer in the notion of doing pro bono work, which has now, of course, become a standard in the profession. He starts out as a local reformer. He then moves on to the state level. One of his enduring legacies was the creation of savings bank life insurance, which in a way is a microcosm of how Brandeis worked. I describe him in the book as a pragmatic idealist, a man who always had his eye on the ideal but knew how to get there. He was no pie-in-the-sky dreamer. Once he confronted a problem, he would think through it, he would research it, he would then come up with a workable solution. The problem he saw was that insurance companies, the big insurance companies, were bilking working men. They were paying rates that were 5, 6, 7 times what middle-class people were paying for whole life policies, and they were paying it for term insurance that could be canceled if they miss even one payment. So he came up with savings bank life insurance. He lobbied it through the state legislature. He kept an eye on it throughout his life. The third career was that of a Zionist. And as one of the reviewers noted in talking about this, Brandeis did not have an aha moment where all of a sudden he becomes a Zionist. The story is interesting. Jacob de Haas was the editor of the Boston Jewish Advocate. And he goes out to interview Brandeis, basically on savings bank life insurance. And the two of them talk, and then as de Haas leaves, he turns around and asks Brandeis if he was related to Louis Dembitz. And Brandeis said, he was my uncle. And de Haas says, he was a noble Jew. Brandeis is curious, why do you say that? And it turns out that Louis Dembitz was one of the first followers of Theodor Herzl in the United States. Brandeis is intrigued. And then, instead of, this is not Paul on the road to Damascus, he asks de Haas to send him some literature. He reads it, and he asks de Haas to send him more literature. And he reads, and then one day he pays the shekel. But he's still interested in things like fighting J.P. Morgan and fighting monopoly and doing other things until World War I breaks out. And he gets a telegram they are having an emergency meeting at the Hotel Marseille in New York to raise money for the Yishuv, which is badly hurt by the fighting because it closes off all the markets that the Yishuv had in Europe. Brandeis goes down there, and his role was to be the following. It was a standard thing. He was going to get up there and say, this is a terrible situation. We have to raise money. I'm going to make a donation. He would then call on Nathan Strauss of Macy's, who would make a big donation, and then they would go home. Instead, at the end of the meeting, Brandeis asks everybody to stay. This is not a man who gave his name without doing the work. He kept them there for 2 days and quizzed them to find out about their various organizations, what they did, how many members they had. And in the end, he decides that he will, in fact, be a working chairman of the Provisional Committee. And he comes up with what I call the Brandeisian synthesis, how he made Zionism acceptable to American Jews. That's in the book. That's your assignment for tomorrow, and we'll have a quiz after that. The fourth career, of course, was Mr. Justice Brandeis. And this was the part that, in many ways, I enjoyed writing most. Because of Brandeis, at the age of 40, I decided to go to law school. I may be one of the few people in my generation who went to law school and actually had a good time there. I wasn't interested in law review because I was already publishing. I didn't have to look for a job because I already had a job. I had a job, and I had job offers if I wanted to become a lawyer. And midway through my first year, I decided I did not want to become a lawyer. I liked the law, but I wanted to have nothing to do with lawyers. So my son became a lawyer, and that was enough for that. But it allowed me to understand and appreciate more fully what Brandeis did. The 20th century history of American constitutionalism is essentially the playing out of ideas that Brandeis presented on the court. Holmes is very famous for his dicta. He could write much better than anybody who's ever been on the court, and he was quoted a lot. But Holmes is not good if you really want to find out what you have to do in that part of the law. The notion that you don't cry fire in a crowded theater doesn't really tell you what free speech really means. It is Brandeis who comes up with the rationale for free speech, that in a democracy, the education of the citizens is necessary so they can carry out their civic duty, and they cannot be educated unless they can hear freely all sides of an argument. And that has been the basis of First Amendment jurisprudence ever since the 1930s. It is Brandeis who, as a young lawyer and his partner, wrote what is probably the most cited article in American legal history, The Right to Privacy. And it is Brandeis on the court who devises the constitutional basis for the right to privacy. Beyond that, it is Brandeis who comes up with the notion of incorporation. That is, that the 14th Amendment takes the Bill of Rights and applies it to the states as well. And essentially, most of the major jurisprudential trends in the last 50 or 60 years have been the playing out of these ideas, and others. Now, Brandeis left a very large written record. There are, of course, the opinions in U.S. reports. We published 7 volumes of letters. If we were on a project that published everything, which we weren't, thank God, there could have been 14 to 20 volumes. He was a prodigious letter writer, and he wrote to his brother almost every day until his brother's death. He had a correspondence with just about every important reformer in the country in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. But there is a problem, and it's a problem that I tried to acknowledge in the introduction, that we never really get to know the inner Brandeis, if you will. He told his daughter that he spent 40 years cultivating an air of calm deliberation. During the horrendous confirmation hearings, in 6 months, I could only find one instance, and one only, where he lost his cool. And then he yelled at his law partner. He didn't go out and do anything public. We know he was the victim of anti-Semitic feeling, but if you read his letters, you would not know that. In only a few letters does he even refer to anti-Jewish prejudice. We know that he shared everything with his wife, but except for the courtship letters, once they were married, he spoke to her every day. You don't have to write a letter to somebody if you're seeing them every day. And he was very careful in his letters. I mean, he gave her all sorts of political gossip and news, but you don't get a sense of, an inner self, of what I feel about this, what his emotions are. His daughter told me the story that after his retirement, he was up in Chatham, and she came there and he was burning letters. And she stopped him. And he said, who would be interested in that? And she said, historians would. So he went through and he said, all right, I'll only burn the ones that are private, which really didn't help me very much. And then, of course, I found out that that particular daughter, Elizabeth, who taught all her life at the University of Wisconsin and unfortunately died from dementia, before she got sick, burned all of her papers as well. This is a family that took the right to privacy very seriously. And as a person, while I certainly admire this, as a historian, I want to wring their necks more than one time. In writing this book, I adopted what historians here will understand as a fat manner. I didn't try to keep myself limited as I was writing. You can always cut. Editors like you to cut. And if you write fat enough, you can cut a lot and they're still happy and you still have more than if you had started out writing thin. One reason I wanted to write fat was because when I started, although I knew an awful lot about Brandeis, I wanted the book to just be able to go, and if something came up, to be able to go with it. The book is 950 pages, which is about 20% shorter than the original manuscript. I am not saying that those are words that are lost to posterity and posterity is the poorer for it. I wrote those for myself. It was a style that this was going to be my retirement project, and I was going to do it the way I wanted, and then worry about, publication and cutting and everything. There are some parts of the book that probably are still fat. There's a little bit of repetition. A couple of reviewers have noted that, including my son, who I told to forget about it. He read it on Kindle. I mean, this is... The book has been good to me. It was a good gig. And I now know what heaven is like for scholars. It's the Rockefeller Villa in Bellagio, where you can sit and work and look out over Lake Como and have them feed you 3 meals a day, including wine, and cater to your every need. Unfortunately, you can only go back once every 10 years, so I'll be almost 80 before they'll let me come back. But I had a good time writing this book, and I hope that those of you who read it will enjoy it as well. And with that, I think I'll stop and just answer any questions you may have. I believe they probably want you to come to the microphone because your words and my answers are for the ages.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. It's nice to see someone smiling after doing so much work. My question is, if Brandeis truly had these 4 different tracks in his life, were they sequential or were they simultaneous? And if they were simultaneous, I mean, he couldn't be a lawyer after he was a Supreme Court judge, I understand that. But how did he organize his day? It sounds like he had a longer day than 24 hours. And how did he go about doing his work?
Okay. He, of course, starts out as a lawyer. As a reformer, he is still a lawyer. And as a Zionist, he is a reformer. What he brings to American Zionism is the organizing and publicity skills that he learned as a reformer. But he starts as a reformer as a pro bono lawyer. And everything he did was very rigorously thought out. He got up early in the morning. As a lawyer, he would read to his children at breakfast. His wife was sick quite a bit. There were many years when not many years, but over a period of time, he was essentially a single parent. Of course, they had 2 or 3 people in the household to help, but she suffered from neurasthenia. And he would go into the office, and a number of people noted that he never wasted time. He didn't chit-chat. He kept his office deliberately cold in the winter, so if you were a client, you came in there, you kept your coat on, you answered questions, you spoke to him, then you escaped to the warmth of the winter outside. It was, so he was, as someone who thought that I was fairly well organized, I mean, this guy just beats me hands down. There's a story that several of his clerks tell, that they would work on this memo to him, and they would work through the night, and they would finish it, and at 5:30 or 6 in the morning, they would slide it under the door of his study to feel it being pulled through from the other side. So he worked a long day, but he took off every August. He wrote that he could do 12 months worth of work in 11, but not in 12. And he took vacations whenever he could. He was a firm believer in vacations to rest the mind. He went camping, he went hiking, he went yachting with a friend. And as he got older, every August he spent out in Chatham, where he canoed up until well into his 80s. But he was an extremely well-organized person. And this can be seen, by the way, in his letters. People thought that Brandeis was cold and dispassionate because you don't have these letters, oh, my darling, da-da-da-da-da-da. His letters usually were first, second, third, very well organized, including the letters to his wife. First, second, third, it's extremely, extremely well organized. And so his careers overlapped, and he practiced being a judge very much with being a lawyer in mind. Harold Lasky once told Oliver Wendell Holmes that it would be a great service to all mankind if he could remind Brandeis that a judicial opinion wasn't supposed to be a Brandeis brief. But the fact of the matter, in his dissents, that's exactly what he wanted. What he was trying to do was educate people, to both the bench and the bar, as to what the problems were. Does that answer? Okay.
Can you tell us something about his relationships with his colleagues? I know one who was intensely anti-Semitic, and I don't know if he tried to deal with him or not. Okay. And I'm especially interested to know how Oliver Wendell Holmes dealt with Brandeis's Zionism.
He didn't.
Okay.
That was not of interest to Holmes. Brandeis served on the court from 1916 to 1939, 23 years. During that time, the bulk of the time, they were in the old court, which was in the basement of the Senate wing of the Capitol. They didn't have the marble palace until 1935. That meant that every justice essentially worked at home or rented an office, as Brandeis did. Brandeis lived in an apartment building. He lived in one apartment and rented another smaller one for his study and for his clerk's study. And in fact, he thought the Marble Palace was much too elegant, and after it opened, he refused to occupy the suite of offices that was reserved for him. So you didn't have the justices all in one building. But with the exception of James McReynolds, who was overtly anti-Semitic, Brandeis seems to have gotten along well with even the most conservative members of the court. He admired Willis Van Devanter, whom he described as a Jesuit cardinal who helped Taft, organize the court. He was, of course, most friendly with Holmes, but remember Harlan Fiske Stone was on the court at the time. Benjamin Cardozo came onto the court. He thought that Charles Evans Hughes was an absolutely wonderful Chief Justice. Holmes, of course, was special, and they had a relationship that went far beyond the court. They would walk down, he lived around the corner from Holmes, and they would walk down to the Capitol together, and until both of them got a little infirm. They had this routine where when they came back, Brandeis would insist on walking Holmes to his front door, and then Holmes would stand there to make sure that Brandeis could find his way back to the street. He kept, both of them got their clerks from Felix Frankfurter, and Brandeis made it a point to get to know Holmes's clerks so he could help keep an eye on Holmes. When Fanny Holmes died, there's a letter from Brandeis to Felix Frankfurter, make sure there is a clerk this summer. Holmes needs one more than ever before, even though Holmes was retiring from the court at that time. So there was a great deal of affection, but I don't know if they ever even discussed Zionism. Holmes wanted to twist the tail of the cosmos, as he put it. He was interested in theory. And in fact, part of the problem with his theory of free speech, the idea of the marketplace of ideas, is while it's a wonderful philosophical concept, it doesn't help lower court judges interpret the First Amendment. The idea of clear and present danger, for example, which he puts forward in Schenck. Well, to the conservative judges on the high and lower courts in the 1920s, any radicalism was both clearly and presently dangerous. Brandeis is much more interested in facts, and you asked about him, the lawyer. When he wrote a dissent, right now most justices, when they go to write an opinion, there is a beginning, the facts of the case, which most of them assign to their clerks to do. Brandeis always wrote it himself because he argued, unless I understand the facts, I can't interpret the law. And if I can convince people that I have the facts right, they will be more ready to accept what I propose as law. So, he was a lawyer throughout the time. He was also a justice. What he had learned before carried over. One summer, Holmes writes this letter, "Brother Brandeis has been after me that I'm too interested in Plato and not enough in the facts. And he's given me all these books. He said I should take them home and read them over the summer, then go down to some of the mills near Beverly so I can see for myself. I hate facts. I think they're very important, but they're like manure. They should be used sparingly." And the next summer he writes, "In consideration of my age and infirmity, Brother Brandeis has spared me facts this summer." Brandeis' reading would amaze people. All those, has anybody here ever read a government document? Has anybody ever read a government document more than the first 2 pages? Then you understand that the government style, they don't hire people to write these things unless they flunk, narrative English. If you pass English 101, you can't write a government document. Brandeis read them. He loved them. If you looked at his library, he had government reports from the most obscure agencies. He loved them. He lived for them. He probably was the only justice on the court, with the exception of Pierce Butler, who could read a corporate financial report. Facts were his life in many ways, and was part of what made him such an effective lawyer and such an effective justice. Uh-oh, somebody's going to quote to me. I didn't write that.
On page 133, conservatives, can you hear me? No,
I can hear you, yes.
Can't. Conservatives, and here one must include Louis Brandeis, who strongly believed in fiscal integrity and a tradition where public good outweighed private interests. My church is proposing a study action for the denomination Unitarian Universalism. And one of the documents that we have as a backup for this, it's called Revitalizing Democracy, is your book, some of the chapters in your book. It hasn't passed yet, but we're proposing it. So what I'm wondering is, do you know any organizations, or grassroots or otherwise, that are trying to carry on the tradition of promoting the general welfare, so that people remember that that is part of the Constitution, which they seem to be forgetting quite a lot lately?
Well, it's interesting. When I taught in Albany, our friends considered Susan and me conservatives. Then we moved to Virginia, where they considered us liberals. Now we're in Gaithersburg, where I think we may have it just about right. Almost every grassroots organization these days is a descendant of what Brandeis did as a reformer in putting together the Savings Bank Insurance League and putting through the Anti-Merger League. Emily's List, which some of you may be familiar with. We are, because they call my wife every day. The Sierra Club, the American Civil Liberties Union, and conservative counterparts, whom, it's interesting, for some reason my name is on the mailing list for the Cato Institution. And I've gone there for a number of programs and found that I was fairly comfortable with the libertarian part of it. Brandeis was very much a Jeffersonian in his belief that, that government is best which governs least. What he wanted, he was a conservative in the Burkean sense of keeping the best of the past in order to get a better future. But there are a lot of grassroots organizations out there. Some of them I don't happen to share their philosophy, but there is do you remember the name of the one, the conservative counterpart of the ACLU? It was, no, not the Federalist Society, that's different. But there is a legal organization that is the conservative counterpart of the American Civil Liberties Union. They show up in a lot of the Supreme Court cases that deal with school prayer. What? It was originally formed out of Pat Robertson's shop down in, that's one of them, but there's another one. Actually, they have the same, it's Americans for Constitutional something of the other. Yes?
There's also the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education.
Yeah. You have a lot of these, and while you may not agree with their particular agenda, what they're doing is essentially trying to create grassroots support, and in many instances for things that are constitutionally valid. There are a lot of groups, for instance, that Americans United for Separation of Church and State, which has conservative counterparts that believe that the Founding Fathers did not intend to create a high wall of separation between church and state. I don't particularly share that view, but there are some scholars who make a very, very good case for it. Judge McConnell, who's now going to be dean out at one of the law schools in the West, is an excellent scholar, and he believes that that high wall of separation was just not what the Founding Fathers intended, that there was supposed to be religion as part of our civic dialogue.
A couple of years ago, we had Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg here receiving her honorary degree. I don't exactly remember when that was, sometime in the 90s. I had a very interesting conversation with her about how much she disagreed with the Brandeis brief on the issue of gender and the protection of women. The Brandeis brief, Brandeis argues, of course, that women are very different than men and need protection. Justice Ginsburg believed the opposite. And of course, 1908, the 1970s and 80s, one can understand the change in views. But my question is this was 1908. In 1909, Brandeis, I believe, becomes involved with the Garment Workers Union.
1910.
1909, 1910, and I probably read it in your book, one of them, that he's really affected by his content with the workers, and that leads him in some ways to a new respect for the Jews. Most of those garment workers are Jewish. And it's a question I've asked before, but really haven't gotten the answer to. Most of the garment workers who went out on strike were activist women. And to what extent was Brandeis impressed by these women, and how did his encounter with these kinds of activists change his opinions from just the year before, or did they? And maybe you could
Okay, now,
enlighten me.
notice what I'm going to do. I'm doing my Hillel thing because I cannot possibly answer your question standing on one foot. Last year, I was at the court with Justice Ginsburg. I'm a member of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and we do a reenactment every year where one of the justices, we take a case, and last year we redid Mueller v. Oregon. And I was talking to Justice Ginsburg ahead. It's not the Brandeis brief that she objects to, which is the idea of marshaling a lot of facts. That and she herself has used that when she was a practicing attorney. There is a big scholarly debate over whether or not there is an anti-woman bias in the Mueller, and of course there is, but it was the bias of the times. This is what people thought then. This was 1908. The group that Brandeis represented was the National Consumers League, which was a women's group. The more radical feminists at the time did not oppose his brief in Mueller. They thought that it could live side by side. Most of them saw it as a first step. Now, as we've changed over the years, I think, one of the things I've argued both in this book and elsewhere, it is ahistorical to apply what we know now in the late 20th and early 21st century about women's history, about the role of women in society, to what people thought then. Now, Brandeis starts off, he's opposed to women's suffrage originally. He comes around. And one reason is he's married to a very bright woman who is an advocate of women's suffrage. He's got 2 very bright daughters. That always helps. His sister-in-law, Josephine Goldmark, and Florence Kelly, with whom he works a great deal. What he does is he comes into enormous contact with bright, intelligent women. Now, he later writes about the Brandeis brief. What it should have been called is What Every Fool Knows. Women are different than men. But that doesn't mean they are inferior to men. Now, the opinion that comes down from the court, of course, says, women's place in the home, all that. And there's a whole historical thing about women's place and hearth and home and like that. Brandeis worked with the materials he had. And unfortunately, by our standards, those materials aren't particularly good. Yes?
Well, that's understandable, and even into the 20s, people were arguing, and feminists were arguing for protective legislation. But my question is, really, did the contact with the workers, the garment workers, change his views in any way?
I argue in the book that it's more changed his view on Jews. He writes to his father that he thinks there is far more to hope for from the Russian Jews than from the Germans. But the people he deals with, the union heads, are almost all men at that time. So I wouldn't be able to argue that it's the women that he comes into contact with. I'm sure he met some of them, but the negotiations for creating the protocol, there wasn't a woman in the room.
We have time for one more question.
Oh. Okay.
One of the main movements in today's social justice initiatives is this idea of corporate social responsibility. And that's directly linked to this notion of legal personhood that's been given to corporations directly through the 14th Amendment. And the whole act of incorporation itself is a legal attempt to separate liability, personal liability, individual liability of shareholders and their assets from the actions of the corporation. And I'm wondering if somehow you can talk about how Justice Brandeis may have conceptualized this sort of paradox that's at the heart of the sort of corporate social responsibility movement and the legal atmosphere within his conception of social justice at large. Thank you.
I think it would be fair to say that Brandeis wanted each corporation to be a good citizen within its personal domain. Let me tell you 2 stories, okay, to illustrate this. One of his clients is a shoemaker, and his workers are going out on strike, and he doesn't know why, because he has always treated them well. Brandeis goes out to look, and what he discovers is, yes, they are getting a decent wage, but they're only working 8 months a year. So, and his argument is, a person can eat 6 meals one day and 0 the next, and that averages to 3 meals a day, but that's not a good way to live. And so Brandeis essentially gets his client to revamp his entire business so that orders come in over the entire year. They come in earlier so that his workers can work steadily. And steadiness of employment becomes one of the things that's a mantra for him for all of his life, okay? He doesn't want this corporation to go give money to charities. He doesn't want this corporation to spend its assets, which as far as he's concerned, are owed to the stockholders. But he wants them to be a good citizen for its workers, okay? That's a little different than this current thing. Now, the second story I want to tell you is in 1926, to mark the 10th anniversary of his appointment to the court, a number of friends raised money for a Brandeis Research Fellowship at the Harvard Law School. And Edward Filene's department store, Edward and Lincoln Filene had been Brandeis' allies and clients forever. For all I know, the firm may still be the client. Edward Filene writes to Brandeis. He said, something has happened, and I want you to know the facts of this. A motion was made at the directors' meeting that Filene should donate $10,000 to this fund. And Edward Filene opposed it. And the reason he opposed it was he was sure that Brandeis would not want corporate assets to be diverted in such a way that he himself was going to make a substantial contribution out of his own money, but he opposed it because he didn't think and Brandeis writes him a letter, absolutely right. Okay? So there are these two notions here. The corporation should look after itself, should look after the interests of its stockholders, and be a good citizen by being a good employer, providing safe working conditions, involving workers. He believed in industrial democracy. I think he would not, from what I know, he would not have been that favorable to this idea of the corporation going out and being a good citizen in the world and using stockholders' money for it, or for giving corporate executives huge bonuses. Thank you very much.